Jazz, blues, bluegrass, gospel, country music, rock and roll and its later manifestations, and even rap are organic indigenous American musical expressions that are not degenerate or malevolent in themselves. They grew out of a conjunction of different cultures, meeting mostly in the New Orleans area and consisting of Irish, African, Hispanic, and even Asian slaves and indentured servants. In the long tradition of slavery, the disconnection to and suppression of the native religious beliefs of the slave was used to demoralize, unmoor, and make more pliable its subjects. In the case of the American slave trade, these beliefs would be forcibly replaced with an Old Testament theology, which both justified their enslavement and gave them a view of the slave master as having a special relationship with Jehovah, thereby preventing rebellion. This conditioning survives in Rastafarianism and Hebrew Israelitism, and their glorification of the Old Testament Exodus and Zion myths. To this day, the wealthiest and most influential families in both Haiti and Jamaica are descended from Jewish plantation owners. Despite their geographic distance, in the Irish Druidic belief system and the West African Yoruba theology, we find remarkable similarities and parallels to the Egyptian, Aryan, Zoroastrian, and in fact a universal wisdom religion, which we can conclude from the apparent lack of contact between these cultures was inherent in humanity from its inception and independent from any priesthood. It is beyond the scope of this work to explore these parallels in depth, but the conflict between this universal system and its tribal antagonist is the background against which everything said here should be considered. In the face of the suppression of the ritual and tradition honoring this belief system, music was a vehicle with which these beliefs, if only in an unarticulated essence, could be expressed under the nose of the slave master without detection. I make this digression, admittedly unworthy of the majesty and complexity of its subject, because it is vital to understand that these musical forms are simply vehicles, not causes. These vehicles were degraded, abused, exploited, and distorted to gradually bring popular music to its current baseness. It is important also to note that this fortuitous conjunction of worldwide cultures, which created indigenous American music, took place in the form of a holistic participation without distinction between performer and audience. The art created was not a one-way form of communication from creator to performer to audience. Contrast this with where we begin our story, and what became in America the heart of the transmission of propaganda and culture in the latter half of the 19th century, the theater. The story of the takeover and domination of American culture by members of a distinctly Hebraic tribe begins in the last 25 years of the 19th century and takes place in the world of the stage. It is true that in Europe this had gradually been occurring in the realms of classical music and literature since before the 19th century. But for the purposes of this work, American theater and its growth and expansion into the other fields of influence serves our focus. That it begins here is fitting in that all the forms, visual, sonic, and lyrical, which would manifest themselves later in the separate industries of film, television, literature, and radio, are contained, womb-like, in stagecraft. Like the morality plays of ancient Greece, the stage had been the transmission point for styles of dress, talk, mannerism, and what was considered socially and morally acceptable. That President Lincoln was violently assassinated by being shot in the head by an actor while attending a play carries a deep resonance when we consider what was to occur in popular culture over the next century. A series of articles appearing in 1921 in Henry Ford's Dearborn Independent newspaper lay out aptly the takeover of the American stage by a theatrical trust constituted solely of tribal New York businessmen. Quote, about 1885, 2 alert tribe members established in New York a so-called booking agency and offered to take over the somewhat cumbersome system by which managers of theaters in St. Louis, Detroit, or Omaha arranged engagements of attractions for their houses for the ensuing season. The old process involved extensive correspondence with producing managers in the East, and many local managers were obliged to spend several months in New York to make up a season's bookings. The advantages were that the booking agency, supplied with a list of the open dates of the houses they represented, were able to lay out a complete season's itinerary, or route, for a traveling company, and enabled the producer of a play his vacation at the seashore instead of passing the sultry mid-season in New York. While the local manager was saved the trouble of much writing or even a trip east, and was content to let the booking concern attend to all the details, and send his next season's bookings when completed. In this manner was laid the foundation of the later-day theatrical trust. The booking firm was that of Claw and Erlanger, the former a young tribe member from Kentucky who had studied law, but drifted into theatrical life as an agent. The latter a young tribe member from Cleveland, with little education but with experience as an advance agent. The booking system was not of their devising. They borrowed their idea from Harry C. Taylor, who established a sort of theatrical exchange, where producers and local managers could meet, desks being provided for them at a small rental, and who took over the bookings in the smaller cities, without foreseeing, but probably scorning, the opportunity thus placed in his hands, to club the whole theatrical world into submission to his dictates. With characteristic shrewdness, Claw and Erlanger elaborated the idea they had borrowed from Taylor, opened competition against the latter, and enlisted a number of tribal advance agents who were beginning to recognize the lucrative opportunities which the theatrical profession afforded." Unquote. This practice of borrowing, or the wholesale stealing of an idea, invention, or simply a patent, and making it their own will be a continuing theme as we travel down this road, and indeed has always been characteristic of the tribal mind. From technological innovations, cinema, television, radio, to the very theological basis of their belief system, which was cobbled together from the myths and traditions of the numerous cultures they insinuated themselves into over thousands of years. Again, from the Dearborn Independent, quote, "The establishment of the tribal booking agency system is the key to the whole problem of the decline of the American stage. The old booking system had the enormous advantage of the personal touch in the relationship between manager and company, and made possible the development of genius in accordance with the organic laws which determine nurture, growth, and fruition. There being no syndicate, no pooling among the Gentile managers of the 1880s, the manager's whole investment was probably tied up in his enterprise. He thus became a part of his group of artists, sharing in their hardships of travel, their joys and sorrows." Unquote. Thus we see an extension of the compartmentalization and depersonalization, which started with the division between audience and performer. In this case, the breakdown of a personal relationship between the performer and management. This was fertile ground in which the exploitation and objectification of the performers, crew, and even writers, combined with the increasing preeminence of profit over value of content, would culminate in pandering to the basest tastes of the lowest common denominator. Quote, "The theatrical trust, which must be described as tribal, because it was that, was at the beginning of the new century in full control of the field. It had reduced what was essentially an art to a time clock, cash register system, working with the mechanical precision of a well-managed factory. It suppressed individuality and initiative, killed off competition, drove out the independent manager and star, excluded all but foreign playwrights of established reputation, fostered the popularity of inferior talent, which was predominantly tribal, sought to debase the dramatic critics of the public press, and foisted countless, quote, stars of mushroom growth upon a helpless public while driving real stars into obscurity. It handled plays, theaters, and actors like factory products, and began a process of vulgarizing and commercializing everything connected with the theater, unquote. A truly breathtaking description written a century ago of the entire world of popular entertainment and culture, pertaining as much to the present day as it does to the time it was published. The following description of the effects of this soulless enterprise upon the public, in particular the youth, is equally prescient. Quote, "The stage today represents the principal cultural element of 50% of the people. What the average young person absorbs as to good form, proper deportment, refinement as contrasted with coarseness, correctness of speech or choice of words, customs and feelings of other nations, even fashions of clothes, as well as ideas of religion and law, are derived from what he hears and sees at the theater. The mass's sole idea of the homes and lives of the rich is derived from the stage and movies. More wrong notions are given, more prejudices created by the tribal-controlled theater in 1 week than can be charged against a serious study of the tribal question in a century. People sometimes wonder where the ideas of the younger generation come from. This is the answer," unquote. Compared to today's situation, 50% doesn't sound so bad. But it is when we turn to the subject of the popular music of the first quarter of the 20th century that the parallels to our own cultural situation become even more remarkable. On August 3, 1920, a suit was begun in the New York Federal District Court, charging 7 music publishing corporations, all owned by the tribe, with violating the Sherman antitrust law. From the New York Times article detailing the suit, quote, "The defendants, it was alleged, controlled 80% of the available copyrighted songs used by manufacturers of phonographs, player piano rolls, and other musical producing instruments, and fixed prices at which the records or rolls were to be sold to the public," unquote. The 20% not included in the suit were controlled by other tribal music houses. As we enter into this exploration, we encounter one of the themes which will be returned to throughout this work: the tribal exploitation of the organic and indigenous musical innovations of Black America, beginning with jazz and/or ragtime. It would be a mistake to assume that the utilization of this and subsequent black musical outgrowths by the tribe in an intentional degradation of culture means that black music is inherently animalistic or base. It is not because of pandering, political correctness, or a racial guilt complex on the author's part that I make this assertion. Jazz, and especially gospel music, are, at least in the author's humble opinion, capable of being among some of the most spiritually uplifting of musical forms. Even rap music is simply a musical vehicle, which can definitely be used to motivate, uplift, and overcome depression, in the same way that rock and roll or really any type of music can. It is the tribal supremacists' use and exploitation of blacks, not just in music but in general, as a vehicle of degradation and a bludgeon against European Americans that is the problem. They view blacks as animalistic and base, and they have for thousands of years. From the tribal viewpoint, the population of the world belongs to different racial categories, each one of which has some use for the advancement and domination of the tribe. And if they do not, they are marked for elimination. For example, whites have always been used in a military role, as pawns to fight their wars, because they are easily led by false appeals to patriotism, altruism, and sacrifice. Whites also have qualities of perseverance and bravery. Of course, these values are apparent in every race, but they are acute in Western Europeans, at least in the eye of the tribe's racial classification. You will always see an increase in patriotic propaganda aimed almost solely at whites when the Zionist is gearing up for another war of expansion and domination. I will be exploring the use of the Western genre of cinema in this aspect in later chapters. Blacks are seen as extremely susceptible to media manipulation by the tribe, and during the mid-1960s they were able to see themselves portrayed as doctors and police chiefs in television and film, in addition to becoming more prominent in popular music. This served a dual purpose of making white America more comfortable with integration and the breakup of their neighborhoods, while at the same time giving blacks a view of the media as being more sympathetic to their pleas for a more dignified representation than the obedient servant or step-and-fetch-it depiction prevalent up until the mid-1960s. When the tribe needed an excuse for the not-so-gradual militarization of the police and the massive expansion of the prison industry, this short period of portraying blacks in a positive light gave way to the genre of blaxploitation. The macho, gun-toting, coke-snorting black gangster, glorified in these films, served as a template for the rise of the street gangs that replaced ideologically driven groups like the Black Panthers in inner-city communities. This genre carried on into gangster rap, and when combined with multiple other social factors, brought inner-city black America into the present era of utter and almost total debasement and misery. Turning again to a pair of Dearborn Independent articles from 1921, How the Tribal Song Trust Makes You Sing and Tribal Jazz Becomes Our National Music, keep in mind that these are descriptions of a national culture in which the radio has yet to be introduced. Musical presentation was confined to phonographs, pianolas, concerts, stage, and the pianos and other musical instruments, also an industry which would become dominated by the tribe, of the household parlor room. But the methods and effects of gradual degradation remain the same today as they were a century ago. The first article, How the Tribal Song Trust Makes You Sing, begins by giving a description of the role of music in American life after the Civil War, and its contrast with the musical scene at the time of writing. Quote, Americans of adult age will remember the stages through which the popular song has passed during the past 3 or 4 decades. War songs persisted after the Civil War and were gradually intermingled with songs of a later time, picturesque, romantic, clean. These latter were not the product of song factories, but the creation of individuals whose gifts were given natural expression. These individuals did not work for publishers, but for the satisfaction of their work. There were no great fortunes made out of songs, but there were many satisfactions in having pleased the public taste. The public taste, like every other taste, craves whatever it is given most to feed upon. Public taste is public habit. The public is blind to the source of that upon which it lives, and it adjusts itself to the supply. Public taste is raised or lowered as the quality of its pabulum improves, or degenerates. In a quarter of a century, given all the avenues of publicity like theater, movie, popular song, saloon, and newspaper, in the meantime having thrown the mantle of contempt over all counteractive moral agencies, you can turn out nearly the kind of public you want. It takes just about a quarter of a century to do a good job. In other days, the people sang as they do now, but not in such doped fashion, nor with such bewildering continuity. They sang songs nonsensical, sentimental, and heroic. But the, quote, shady songs were outlawed. If sung at all, the shady songs were kept far from the society of decent people. Like the styles of the demi-monde, that formerly were seen only in the abandoned sections of cities. The songs of smut had their geographical confinement, but like the fashions of the demimonde, they broke out of their confines to spread among polite society. In those days the people sang. They sang together. They sang wherever they met. It was the days of that now extinct institution known as the singing school. People could sing together. The songs were common property, known to everybody, proper to everybody. In course of time, the fashion of public song underwent a change. An entirely new crop of titles appeared, dealing with an entirely different series of subjects than the songs they displaced. By insensible gradations, now easily traceable through the litter of songs with which recent decades are strewn, we have been able to see the gradual decline in the popular song supply. Sentiment has been turned into sensuous suggestion. Romance has been turned into eroticism." Unquote. During this period, when the mass production and distribution of media made possible by the Industrial Revolution is being introduced, the distinction between popularity and familiarity becomes blurred. A song no longer passes from the composer to the parlor, to the barroom or school choir based on its inherent musical salience. Now the power exists to flood the market with any particular product the tribe who monopolizes the industry chooses. If it is the survival strategy of this tribe to dominate by weakening everyone outside of its circle, the complete power over the cultural milieu is priceless. But more powerful over the mind of the public than the prevalence of the product or its easy availability is the power of its constant repetition. Quote, "Popularity, when interpreted by the tribe who manufacture jazz for the United States, means familiarity, that's all. The theory is that a song need not possess merit as regards words or music to be successful. It can be popularized artificially by constant repetition, until it becomes familiarized to the public ear, and thus familiarized, it becomes successful. The principle is expressed in the words of the song, 'Everybody's doing it.' You go to the theater and hear a song. Next day at lunch, the cafe singer is singing the same song. Blaring phonographs used for advertising purposes blat out the same song at you as you pass on the street. You walk past an afternoon band concert in the park. The band is playing the same song. If you are a normal person, you have a feeling that perhaps something has been going on in the world while you were engaged with your own affairs. The song, you say to yourself frankly, is silly and the music trivial, but you keep your opinion a secret, because after all, everybody's singing it. Not long after you find yourself humming it, you go home and your daughter is practicing up on the piece. It yells its way through your home, and through your neighborhood, and through your city, and through your state, until in sheer disgust and in one day, the people pitch it bodily out of doors. But behold, another song is waiting to take its place, a song fresh from Yiddish Tin Pan Alley, and the agony is repeated. This occurs from 30 to 50 times a year. That is the principle. Repeat it until it becomes familiar. That gives it the veneer of popularity." Unquote. Obviously, this same pathetic strategy is just as effective today as it was in the 1920s. The only difference is that we cannot get much lower in terms of debasement, not only of lyrics, but of musical quality. There are also more flavors of debasement to choose from. The aspect of taking or appropriating a musical innovation or style, and degrading it, has also gone unchanged for the past 100 years. Quote, "In this business of making the people's songs, the tribe have shown, as usual, no originality but very much adaptability, which is a charitable term used to cover plagiarism, which in turn politely covers the crime of mental pocket-picking. The tribe do not create, they take what others have done, give it a clever twist, and exploit it. They have bought up all the old hymn books, opera scores, and collections of folk songs. And if you stop to analyze some of the biggest hits of the Yiddish song manufacturers, you will find they are woven on the motif and the melody of clean songs of the last generation. The music jazzed a little, the sentiment sensualized very much, and set upon their smutty road across the country." Unquote. Morality, ethics, honor, modesty, etc. were still strong values among the vast majority of the American population during the first quarter of the century. Breaking through the psychological defenses and bypassing the repulsion felt by the average consumer required a more complex technique than that used today of simply telling the youth over and over that this is the new hip thing, and then depending on peer pressure. From the Dearborn Independent, quote, "Tribal purveyors to degenerate appetites have a peculiarly devilish system of presenting the same song in 2 or 3 grades. There will be the song as it is sold at the music store to the addlepated young men and women who fill their leisure with hearing or humming the syncopated senility. Young men and women who pitiably imagine they are keeping up with the times. The songs thus sold and sung are rotten enough, but there is the same song class 2. The theme and melody are the same, but it goes a little further. There is a line or two in each stanza, which dips below even the low standard which tribal jazz has permitted in some of our parlors. And there is class 3, same theme, same melody, but going the limit." Young men about town usually know class 2 and class 3. The instance has been known that young women have become acquainted with these lower grades also. Forgetfulness by young men while singing at the piano evenings has given hints of the filthier version. And even where version 1 has been strictly adhered to, the mutual knowledge, politely concealed, has created an atmosphere far from wholesome. The diabolical cunning with which an unclean atmosphere is created and sustained through all classes of society, and by the same influence, will not be overlooked by any observer. There is something satanic about it, something calculated with demonic shrewdness, and the stream flows on, growing worse and worse, to the degradation of the non-tribal public and the increase of tribal fortunes." Unquote. To go over the actual business practices, the methods of monopoly, distribution, and the destruction of competition, would take more than a few chapters and would make for dry reading. The case of David Sarnoff and his domination of early radio and television does, however, give such a typical example of tribal shrewdness and ruthlessness that a cursory survey of his life and business practices should be included here. Sarnoff was born in 1891 to a tribal family in a small village in the Russian Empire. He spent his childhood in yeshiva studying tribal religious texts until his family migrated to New York in 1900. The official story of his adolescence is full of the typical tales of hardship, including the sick father and having to support the family by selling papers on street corners, until a chance encounter led him to employment at the commercial cable company. Because of the severe anti-Semitism he encountered at the commercial cable company, he wasn't allowed to take a day off for Rosh Hashanah. He left and found employment with the Marconi Wireless Telegraph Company of America. Here, he supposedly works his way up from office boy, becomes an operator of a wireless on ships, and then heroically stays awake 3 days, next to his wireless, waiting to confirm the fate of the Titanic. This last story is later confirmed to be a blatant lie. In 1919, General Electric buys American Marconi, and the Radio Corporation of America, or RCA, is formed with Sarnoff serving as its commercial manager. In this position, Sarnoff used RCA's stranglehold on the Marconi patents to create a monopoly in which you could not legally manufacture or sell a radio without paying RCA a large royalty. He then leveraged this dominance, to organize hundreds of radio stations into what became the National Broadcasting Company in 1926. NBC at this point becomes the primary provider of free news, music, and sports. In 1929, RCA purchases the Victor Talking Machine Company, the biggest manufacturer of phonographs and phonograph records at the time. The biography of Emil Berliner, the Jewish founder of Victor and original copyright holder of the His Master's Voice logo, is also one of shady and ruthless business deals, and one of many patent disputes that Thomas Edison, inventor of the phonograph and devout student of theosophy, fought over his lifetime with tribal inventors. Berliner fought him for patent rights, revolving around who first used carbon in the transmission of speech. Berliner's patent was ruled invalid. In the late 1920s, early innovations in the development of television technology caught Sarnoff's attention. A young Mormon inventor named Philo T. Farnsworth had been making sketches of a technology which would transmit images since 1921, when he was only 15. Like most great inventions, the initial idea seems to precipitate into individual and unconnected minds around the same time. These individuals develop different components, the cathode tube, for example, and then these components combine or crystallize into a workable technology. Farnsworth seems to be the catalyst for this crystallization, and by the late 20s he had obtained funding for a lab to develop on his ideas. Sarnoff's RCA had been developing their own television prototypes in a lab under the auspices of another tribe member named Zworykin, by combining the innovations of earlier pioneers in television. These endeavors on the part of RCA hit a roadblock when it was discovered that Farnsworth had patented a vital part of the technology needed for a workable version of the first television. Sarnoff offered Farnsworth $1 million for his patent, on the condition that he would henceforth be employed by RCA, therefore putting any further inventions by Farnsworth under RCA control. Farnsworth refused this offer and went to work for the Philco Company, one of Sarnoff's most implacable competitors. An enraged Sarnoff then threw an army of well-funded patent lawyers at Farnsworth and Philco, and an intricate maze of litigation ensued, which would carry on through the 1930s. Sarnoff would end up having to pay Farnsworth the $1 million for the use of his patents, and thenceforth Sarnoff would call himself the, quote, father of television, prompting Farnsworth to remark, "The baby had been born with a beard." Funding for television innovation stalled during World War II, and over the 1940s, Farnsworth patents expired. After the war, Sarnoff's NBC would become the #1 broadcaster, with hundreds of stations licensed to them across the U.S. Farnsworth would go on to work for ITT, and develop more than a few vital innovations which are still in use today, not least of which were vital components of the air traffic control system. Despite this, the years of patent disputes and litigation took their toll on him, and he would die virtually penniless from alcohol-related pneumonia in 1971. In the saga of David Sarnoff's business endeavors, we are given just one example of how one tribe member gifted with limitless unscrupulousness, funding, and legal largesse can come to dominate almost the entire field of electronic media, spanning multiple modes of broadcast, including even the phonograph. What concerns us in terms of the thesis of this work is what influence did his background have on the content broadcasted. Sarnoff was not what you would call a secular tribal member. He spent years studying multiple tribal scriptures in yeshiva. When we consider the insular nature of his community over thousands of years, not to mention the inbreeding involved, and the strict injunctures and religious trauma inflicted over centuries, it would be asinine to dismiss the idea that he would not use his power to influence what would be broadcast to tens of millions of Gentiles that he perceived as at least subservient to tribal supremacism. The monopolization and use of cinema and publishing for the same purposes and by the same group could be explored here as well, and over the course of this work I will be dipping into both periodically to show their parallels to music in whatever cultural change is being inflicted during a particular genre. Suffice it to say that the same tactics and strategies were often used to consolidate control over these cultural vectors, and like today, any protests by the public were met with accusations of anti-Semitism and bigotry. Another important and salient avenue of exploration which I encourage the reader to pursue on their own is the strong ties, during this earlier period, between white slavery and show business. In that light, it should be noted that because of the money laundering opportunities inherent in show business, there has always been a deep element of organized crime involved. Even at the lowest level of box office income, there is nobody checking how many customers actually enter the theater. The deceptive way in which organized crime is depicted and its glamorization in mass media will be addressed in later chapters.